Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to ethics class. We're nearing the end of the semester. We have 4 classes left, and then the final exam. So for the next couple of classes or so, we're going to take up the topic of abortion. There are a couple of readings, a couple of chapters in your Schaefer-Landau book, which is this book. It's probably backwards, I know, because that's the way it works on phones in the selfie mode. Chapters 28 and 29. One is by Judith Jarvis Thompson, rather famous article from way back when, I think 1971, and another from an individual by the name of Don Marquis or Marquis, not sure how he pronounces his name. Now, we're not going to take up those 2 articles just yet. Prior to getting in to those 2 articles, we are going to kind of go over some generalities with regard to abortion. And the first thing we're going to do is kind of look at its connection with euthanasia, because it's all sort of part of one component here when we look at euthanasia, abortion, and infanticide. One of the things to keep in mind at this point is the reason we study philosophy and the reason we study ethics, the reason we study different philosophical and ethical theories is not really just out of curiosity to find out what different people have said, although that can certainly be interesting, and there's nothing wrong with studying any subject from that point of view. But really what we're interested in when we look at different philosophical theories, and in our case, different ethical theories, is we're trying to come to that point of judgment with regard to which ethical theory is true. And so you remember kind of that's been the course that we've been on ever since we started the class in January. And I know that I went over this in the first and second classes. We've been on this sort of trip to find out how do we come to the point where we think we can legitimately judge which ethical theory is true. There are a number of elements that play into this, and one of these, I'm looking at your notes and I'm looking at my notes all at the same time, so pardon me if I'm looking down a little bit. Part of this is that we want to keep in mind as we get into somewhere in here, and I noticed and I remember that I put these somewhere in your notes, but we want to get into, again, the distinction between the ethical and the legal, right? How do they coexist? And we know that in the 2 theories that we're studying, voluntarism says that all rights are legal and or conventional. We know that the other theory that we're studying, realism, says that some rights are legal and some rights are natural. So that's another sort of point of contact for us to try to come to grips with the answer to the question, which ethical theory is true? Now then, as we get into, as I mentioned in your notes, as we get into the specific consideration of abortion and euthanasia, it's probably good to recall some of the central points of euthanasia, because we had a little bit of an Easter break in there, and it might be a while since you watched the last video, as it would have been, there would have been a week between classes were we in class in a normal situation. You remember that when we're looking at euthanasia, the question arose of the distinction between a human person and a human being, a person and a human being. And the question arose in that with regard to whether or not those 2 terms, human being and person, designate the same reality, or whether or not they designate 2 different realities. When we say human, do we mean person? Or when we say human, do we mean something else than person? When we say person, for example, do we mean human with some characteristics in addition to those characteristics which enable something to be human? Now, that's a philosophical kind of discussion which we went into with regard to euthanasia, and I'm going to keep reminding you of those three characteristics that voluntarists propose that differentiate a person from a human being. Characteristics such as rationality, autonomy, and self-consciousness. Those are the three characteristics proposed by some voluntarists, and I mentioned to you Peter Singer in particular. Those are the three characteristics that distinguish a person from a human being, so that you get to the point where you can say, or the voluntarist can say, that not all human beings are persons. Some are, some aren't, right? The realist makes no such distinction, as you'll recall. So if you're a human being, you're also a person. And those characteristics which the voluntarist points to are not dealt with in the same way by the realist. It's not that they're not obviously significant characteristics. Of course, rationality, self-consciousness, and autonomy are significant characteristics of a human being. But for the realist, they are essentially present all through the existence, from the very beginning to the very end of the existence of the human being. And the voluntarist, therefore, takes a little bit more of an incremental approach, you might say, and views these kinds of characteristics as coming into being and going out of being over the course of a person's life, perhaps. So that's a question which you can ask, which you see in number 4 of your notes. Are all human beings also persons? All right. So when we review the questions of euthanasia and abortion, we also have to deal with the questions that are dealt with there in number 7, right? The question rises for those who favor abortion: is it sometimes ethically permissible to kill an innocent human being or an innocent person? And once again, as I mentioned to you here, don't confuse this with the type of killing that we were concerned with in self-defense, war, and capital punishment. In abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia, the focus is always on an innocent human being, whereas that is not the focus in terms of self-defense, war, and capital punishment. There we have to bring in the possibility, at least, if not the probability or likelihood, of guilt. So there are different kinds of questions, right? In abortion and infanticide, we have a similar question in terms of what we have in euthanasia. Do innocent human beings and persons have a right to life or not? That is going to impinge, you might say, on how we're going to go about coming to grips with the truth of the matter with regard to abortion and euthanasia. There are always going to be elements of this where individuals disagree, and the key that we're focusing on here is how do we best understand these elements of disagreement. So we don't want to come to this, not that you don't come to it with opinions already formed, but we don't want to come to this with a closed mind in the sense that we don't want to ever try to see whatever the other side is. And there's always another side. There's always at least two sides. I am not implying, and don't ever intend to imply, that both sides can be equally right. Right? This is a very good example of where the general position of voluntarism and the general position of classical realism are incompatible. So the judgment has to come down one way or the other. Your judgment has to come down one way or the other. Of course, we always like to get along, but we can get along even if we disagree. This is one of the hardest things to do in civil society, but which we have to do, and we have to keep trying to do as consistently as possible, and that is we have to try to keep getting along and keep trying to understand and keep trying to see what the reasons are for the positions that we disagree with. Sometimes it can be challenging. Now then, sometimes we view questions like abortion and infanticide as types of non-voluntary euthanasia. The reason for that is, obviously, that there is a killing of a being, and in the case of non-voluntary euthanasia, you remember the being in question was not able to understand or consent to its own killing. As a footnote, that is not to imply that understanding or consent to one's own killing changes the ethical character of that killing. The realist, for example, is going to say if it's wrong in one instance, it's wrong in both instances, whether or not there's understanding or choice. The voluntarist position has the potential to be, we might say, a little bit more fluid, wherein understanding and consent can change the ethical legitimacy of the killing of an innocent person. What's under consideration now with abortion and infanticide, and you'll see in a second why I keep tying those two together so constantly, what's under consideration here with regard to abortion and infanticide is the question of a being who, while it may have the essence of the abilities to understand and to consent, has not yet reached the development stage where those capacities, those capabilities are able to be properly exercised, right? So that's what makes it similar to non-voluntary euthanasia. That brings us to the role of consent, or the role of choice, you might say. And of course, we've faced this question several times throughout the course of the semester. And one of the ways of looking at it is in terms of the question, does consent make something ethical? You'll remember that rather gruesome example from, and now it's probably a couple months ago, that I gave you entitled The Consenting Victim. A rather gruesome example of the two individuals who met up in Germany and did what they did. You'll remember the example. We don't have to recall the details at this point. But that was precisely the question with regard to that example. Did their consent make their action ethically legitimate? Well, we're going to find that same kind of issue arising here with regard to abortion and euthanasia, not so much with regard to the one killed, because as we've already stated in characterizing this as possibly a type of non-voluntary euthanasia, the being killed can't give consent, can't understand, but the one doing the killing obviously is consenting and does understand. We'll get to another point about that understanding and that consenting later, but objectively speaking, right, and this applies really to more than one actor in this whole scenario, there is understanding, at least to some extent, and there is consent, at least to some extent. So the question also arises, which we've looked at, and again the consenting victim serves as an example scenario, can we consent to wrong actions? Now, both theories would pretty much say that yes, that's the case, even though they would differ on what the criteria are which enable something to be a wrong action. But that's another question. The question to think about always. Can we consent to wrong actions? There are some who maintain that if consent is present when we perform the action, if it's true consent, as we might say in the medical world, full and informed consent, if it's consent freely given, then it can't be wrong, right? Now, not everybody would agree with that. Not all voluntarists would agree with that, and certainly realists would not agree with that. But it's a question to keep in mind. And we ourselves utilize this question when we're engaging in the process of rationalization. You'll remember the process of rationalization from way back when in the textbook. I can't remember if that was late in the first section or early in the second section, but it'll come up in the final exam, so you might want to remember it now anyway. Remember the process of rationalization, right? We encounter a possibility of performing an action that's wrong. We figure out ways to sort of label that action as right, and then we perform the action, now having convinced ourselves that we're not doing something wrong, but we're doing something right or good or true or just. All right? Another question. If we have a right to do something, is it always the right thing to do? Again, you can go back and think about this question in terms of how we considered it with capital punishment. There are many in the realist tradition who maintain that capital punishment is ethically legitimate, but that for a number of different reasons we should refrain from using it. So we have a right to do it, but they're coming to the conclusion that it's not the right thing to do. We saw that also in self-defense. If it was just us against the attacker, you remember the sort of dictum that said we're required to use all ordinary means of preserving our life. And if self-defense qualifies, as most think that it does, as an extraordinary means of preserving our life, then if it's just us, if it's just our life under consideration, we could forego the use of that extraordinary means. And the same could be said with regard to other examples of as well, examples that we don't really have time to get into in this particular course. But examples that come from the medical field, like the use of extraordinary means to preserve your life if you encounter certain difficulties and illnesses. Typically, kidney dialysis is one that sometimes fits into the category of extraordinary care. Again, it depends on a lot of other circumstances, but it could fit into that category of extraordinary care, which you would not, under the realist interpretation, be obligated to use. Now, if on the other hand, kidney dialysis was actually considered at a certain point in life to be an ordinary means of care, you would have an obligation. So it gets more complicated the more that we descend into certain details. All right, what's an abortion? Now, I've given you some definitions here, or at least some words under the idea of abortion. We don't normally use the term abortion with regard to a spontaneous abortion. We use the term miscarriage. And we do so because we look at that not as an injustice, not as an offense against another human life, but as simply a misfortune of nature. Something just doesn't develop and happen the way it's supposed to develop and happen. We don't always know why. We perhaps almost never know why. But it does happen, and it does happen with some frequencies, and so it's something which is technically speaking an abortion. But since the human will is not involved, there's no moral culpability which can be assigned to that particular happening. It's more of an event in nature. It's not something that we can that we can cause, is not necessarily something that we can keep from happening. Now, obviously, if a woman who's pregnant can take precautions, and you've probably all seen the big signs that say drinking alcoholic beverages is dangerous to pregnant women and so forth. But oftentimes, miscarriages happen when all precautions have been taken and the woman's been taking care of herself properly and so forth. So we're not concerned with that. Right? There's no real ethical problem there that we need to concern ourselves with at the level that we're considering the issue, because we're not getting into the details of one's personal health practices. What we're concerned with is what's technically referred to as a procured abortion. Right? Now, this is an abortion which is viewed by some as an injustice. And this is the kind of activity which does involve human understanding and human will. So, in order to kind of more completely understand the nature of an abortion, you have to understand exactly what a pregnancy is. And that's what I've given you here, the written out in your notes definition of pregnancy. It's just a basic biology book kind of definition. The development of a new, I should say of, not is, the development of a new biologically human organism in the womb of a woman. It's the only place it happens, naturally, I should say, naturally, that starts with the process of impregnation of an ovum, conception, that's what we call it, and normally ends with the birth of a child, either full term or premature. So we know the baby has to stay in the womb for so long, but there are greater and greater strides in technology which make possible the ability to prolong the life of a child born prematurely. And those of you who might be in the nursing field, for example, would be well familiar with these kinds of elements. So it normally ends either with the birth of a child or that it ends with an abortion, either spontaneous or procured. The word normally, by the way, goes with birth, because those other two instances, a miscarriage or a procured abortion, are not natural. Now this brings us to a question that you might refer to as the line of life. We're here speaking very much in an Aristotelian sense. When Aristotle, remember, talked about happiness, he talked about it in terms of a whole life well lived, a whole life from beginning to end. And the end that Aristotle looked at was the point of death, the point of whether it's a natural death or an accidental death or whatever, but the point of death for the human being, which we don't know when that's going to be for any of us. The beginning he talked about in terms of its physical, biological, human beginning. So there's a sort of a definitive beginning and end when we look at this Aristotelian kind of viewpoint. And it's actually also the way that the voluntarists look at biological human life. You'll remember we were talking about euthanasia. I'd made for you the distinction, which you should recall, between being biologically alive and being biographically alive. For the voluntarist, we are biologically alive from the point of conception until the point of death. We may or may not be biographically alive during all that period. In fact, we're not, according to the voluntarist. That it takes a while for our biography to become our biography, for our identity to become our identity, and that may be lost during our life or towards the end of our life because of various factors. Both voluntarists and realists agree that life begins when it begins. That point that I just put in the definition there, the impregnation of an ovum, conception. Both voluntarists and realists agree that that is when life begins, and they both agree that there is an end of life at human death. So we're not concerning ourselves here with questions of an afterlife, right? We're only concerning ourselves with the question of life from its beginning until its end. So there's the point of conception, there's the point of time, the time which is around 9 months that the being spends in the womb. There's the process of birth, there's the rest of life, and then there's death. The rest of life can be a very short time. It could be a minute or less, or it could be 100 years or more. Both the voluntarists and the classical realists agree that birth does not mark an ethically significant dividing line. You'll notice that's point number 16 in your notes. Does birth mark an ethically significant dividing line? Notice I should have underlined the word ethically. Maybe I will before I give you the notes, if I remember it. An ethically significant dividing line. Birth is significant for a lot of reasons. One is so that we have an excuse to have a party once a year, right? So birth is a point in our lives which we're aware of. We're not aware of, or at least I don't think we're aware of, the moment of conception. Will technology someday develop a conception indicator so that, at the point after the appropriate act of a man and woman, a little bell goes off or some little, I don't know what, alerts them to the fact that conception has occurred. I don't know if technology will ever make that possible, but who knows? It would be an interesting development. It would be an interesting piece of knowledge because we normally don't have that knowledge for at least some period of time that conception has taken place. So you can sort of, if you want to think in a strange sort of way, what it would be like if you knew immediately when conception had occurred. A little ding, right? Well, that's not the point. The point is that both the voluntarists and classical realists agree that birth does not mark an ethically significant dividing line. Why? Well, on the one hand, for the classical realist, you are a human being and a person from the moment of conception, so for the entire period before birth, during birth and after birth, all the way until the point of death. You're a person, you're a human being, and you have all the characteristics and rights associated with being a human being. The voluntarist views it differently. The voluntarist says that you're not a person before birth, you're not a person at the moment of conception, you're not a person for the entire time that you spend in the womb, and this is most important to note for the voluntarist, for at least a good and growing majority of them, you're not a person until some time after birth. And you could also, as we've discussed with euthanasia, lose that personhood either through accident or illness during your life or towards the end of your life, say, for example, in the instances of senile dementia. But where are we here with abortion and infanticide? You're not a person for the voluntarist before you're born, and you're not a person for some period of time after you're born. Now, I mentioned to you last time one of the world's most prominent voluntarists. He also refers to himself as a consequentialist or a utilitarian, and that is Peter Singer. And if you haven't looked him up, it's interesting to do so. Peter Singer has proposed different lines when he thinks that the human being who is not a person passes over into being a person. He started out with about a year when he thought that a human being actually became a person. He has since backed that down, and now I think he's all the way back down to around a month or so, wherein the human being who has been born has not yet achieved enough of the characteristics of being a person in order to be given the rights of a person. What does that mean? Well, most specifically and most importantly for the issue that we're considering right here, it means that if for whatever reason an individual did not obtain an abortion before birth, the human being who's now been born can still be killed up to a period of about a month, and there would be no, or in Singer's view, should be no ethical or legal problems or sanctions with the killing of that human being. So you're not a person before you're born, and you're not a person after you're born. That is the issue which is dealt with here in number 15, which is called the line of life, right? So you should know how voluntarists and classical realists answer the question given you in number 16, right? Now, if you're thinking of it from the realist point of view, you might recall those abstract classes that we had a few classes ago on the ontology of ethics. And if you remember in there, the sort of the central concept of everything that we talked about during those classes was the idea of essence. What is something's essence? And here we can now ask the question, is the essence of the human person present at conception? And you might again look at the examples that we looked at there, the example of the tulip and the example of the oak, right? So the tulip is not a completely developed tulip flower. The oak is not an essentially developed oak tree when they're both dormant in the ground, but the essence is present. They couldn't be what they're going to be when they're fully developed if that essence wasn't there. So this also affects the sort of long period of development with regard to us as human beings from the classical realist point of view. For the realist, the essence is there as soon as that new being comes into existence, and it stays there until that particular being goes out of existence at death. All right, now, what's the act of abortion? This brings us to number 18. What's the act of abortion? And here it's always good to recall the three elements of every action as a whole: the act itself, the intention, and the circumstances. So what is the act? You can think about this in terms of some of our previous scenarios. When you think about the act is what we're trying to describe when we